After establishing his situation-based view of ethics, Aristotle now turns his attention to the character of the agent. An agent-centered as opposed to act-centered focus is a core element of Greek ethics and differentiates it from modern ethical theories such as utilitarianism, which focuses on the act. Under Aristotle's ethics, a good man is not simply one who performs a good act. Rather, he must perform it in a virtuous manner, reflecting his virtuous disposition. For Aristotle, a disposition is a state of character. It is a habit, a tendency, a readiness to behave in a particular way. We can say we have certain dispositions, and that means we have a tendency to do certain things. So one's character is defined by the things we are disposed to do, the kinds of behaviours we naturally or habitually tend towards. So in Aristotle's thinking, virtue is a disposition because it is understood as a disposition to behave in a way where we seek the mean. The next 3 chapters of Book 2 investigate the role of disposition, as well as pleasure and pain, in his view of the good life. We've already seen how Aristotle incorporates pleasure into his ethical conception by assigning it a role in conjunction with virtue. In this section, he discusses pleasure and pain and how we might use it as a useful indicator of whether one possesses a virtuous character. So, the kind of pleasure and pain one feels, at what activities and in what quantity will indicate if one's character is virtuous. For example, at the start of chapter 3, Aristotle states that the man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this is temperate, while the man who is annoyed is self-indulgent. In short, the pleasure and pain one experiences at performing the virtues tell us if they are disposed to virtue. Therefore, you cannot be virtuous if you do not take pleasure in virtuous activities. So Aristotle clearly links pleasure and virtue and pain and vice. But he understands that not all people feel pleasure at the right things or in the right way, so the importance of habituation is crucial. We need to feel delight and pain at the things that we ought. This is where upbringing is important. So unlike thinkers who dismiss the relevance of pleasure from morality, Aristotle pulls it into the centre. Pleasure can become an indicator of the good if we learn to distinguish the right kinds of pleasure. And here it is in standard form. So what we ought to do, according to Aristotle, then, is aim for 3 objects of choice: the noble, the advantageous, and the pleasant, and avoid their contraries: the base, the injurious, and the painful. Learning what to seek and what to avoid is what locating the mean is all about. So for Aristotle, the link between moral virtue and pleasure and pain is crucial, and thus should be the focus of the whole inquiry, as he says. In other words, it is not enough to simply learn what acts one should do, but to learn how to feel delight and pain in the correct manner, as follows. Now obviously this idea of feeling delight and pain in the right or wrong manner is problematic. Surely we do not have control over our feelings, but only our actions. Therefore, could we not be considered kind simply by performing acts of kindness without having to be in a particular state or disposition? Now, in this tricky section in chapter 4, Aristotle answers this objection. Now, his answer contains his important distinction between simply doing what is virtuous and doing it from the right state, or as the virtuous person would do it. It is not enough to simply do the act, because what if we hit upon the mean by accident or luck, or just by copying others? In other words, it is possible to act temperately without knowing that our action is temperate, without deciding to do it because it is temperate, without the action expressing our firm and settled temperate state of character, and without our receiving pleasure from the temperate action. Thus, Aristotle does not separate the act itself from the agent in determining its moral virtue. Simply doing an act is not enough for it to be considered virtuous. Now, from the passage just quoted, we can see Aristotle's criteria for the condition the agent must be in when acting. There are 3. First, she must have knowledge of what she is doing. Second, she must choose the virtuous act because it is virtuous for its own sake. And thirdly, the action must proceed from a firm and unchanging virtuous character. And we can add a 4th criteria because Aristotle stipulates it elsewhere, which is that she experiences the right kind of pleasure from this act. So as we see, it is not simply enough to do the act, we must do it with the right state of mind or character. And in standard form, here it is. Therefore, under Aristotle, there is no credit for doing something you don't want to do or don't take pleasure in. Aristotle is no deontologist, and his notion of virtue is not concerned with duty, but instead character and disposition. Now, in Chapter 5, Aristotle adds a final argument to shore up the role of dispositions in moral decision-making. He aims to argue once and for all that moral virtue is a state of character, not a passion or capacity. Now, to do this, he uses a reductio ad absurdum argument to claim that we cannot locate virtue in the sphere of the emotions, as we cannot blame or praise someone for simply feeling things. Similarly, with regard to capacity, which is the capacity to feel or not to feel, we cannot be praised or blamed. Thus, virtue is a disposition, because we've eliminated everything else. And in standard form, now this may seem confusing, but it is worth remembering that a disposition is a state of character that arises through action, rather than simply the possession of an emotion, capability, or capacity. A simpler way of understanding it is that it is almost something that has been earned, or at the very least cultivated through activity, and thus we can be praised or blamed for it, rather than something we are born with. Now, this links back to the arguments about habituation, that moral virtue is not natural, it is cultivated. So after cementing dispositions as a core tenet in moral virtue, Aristotle now returns to the doctrine of the mean in the subsequent chapters, offering more detail and advice on how to preserve it.